Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. We have with us today the UN Special Rapporteur on Countering Terrorism and Human Rights, Ms. Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, who presented her report to the UN Human Rights Council's 52nd session yesterday. She will have opening remarks, after which we will open the floor for questions. With that, I give the floor to Ms. Ní Aoláin.
Thank you. I'm very glad to offer some opening remarks to this press conference that marks the issuance of my annual report to the Human Rights Council. The report is really focused on a topic that is of significant importance to states, a highly compelling topic related to the development, use and transfer of new technologies. And I address all of those issues in the context of counterterrorism, recognizing that counterterrorism and security justifications have been consistently used to essentially enable both the development of these technologies, but their mainstreaming of use. I want to say, and I said yesterday at the Council, there are many, many positive things to say about new technologies. They have an enormous capacity to transform lives. They can enhance the full realization of human rights, of human equality, of dignity for people all around the world, and in particular, the fair access to technologies and the closing of gaps on access to technologies can address some of the big human rights gaps we see for some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people on the planet. But even as all of that is actually true, at the same time, what we're all seeing is the risks posed by new technological advancements, particularly those technologies that have been used, developed, and applied to counterterrorism or threats, or so-called security threats. And what my report does, it highlights three very specific trends that I'm seeing among states' use of these technologies, and then I'm just going to briefly give two examples of those trends. One is the use of drones, and the other is the use of biometric technology. So the first trend is when these technologies are used and developed, counterterrorism or security kind of fears or rationales are often used as the legal and policy basis to adopt them, meaning states say, we have this threat, we need this technology. And when that happens, the pattern we see is that states say, but we're only going to use this technology in a very limited way to counter this specific kind of threat. But what we're seeing in practice is that exceptional rationale doesn't last very long. And this brings us to the second trend. So the first trend is that we use the rationale of security to justify the use and development and sometimes the transfer of these technologies. And the second is that there is consistently in the adoption of these new technologies either no or very little human rights, or at best a kind of a performative nod to human rights, but very little mainstreaming of human rights protections into what are essentially high-risk technologies. And the result of that, I think, has been an abject failure to, in a way, regulate the risks that these technologies pose for every human being on the planet. And we'll talk a little bit about why every human being is affected by these kinds of technologies and the impact on the quality of life, the quality of human rights protection around the globe in the adoption of these technologies has been enormous. The third trend I'm seeing is that the rationale that states use, that this is an exceptional use and that it's going to be short-term, rarely ever happens in practice. What we actually see is something quite different, is that something that starts off as exceptional gets mainstreamed into everyday life. And that's where the impact on every person is seen. And so this slippage from exceptional use justified by counterterrorism to regular use for all kinds of purposes, some of them quite nefarious, speaks to the real challenges that we're facing in regulating these technologies and ensuring that they don't pose risks to the protection of human rights. So where are we seeing these trends? Well, we're seeing them in biometric data collection mandates. We have those from the UN Security Council based on a counterterrorism threat. We see them in the collection of airline passenger data information. So anybody who's getting on a plane and you're giving over your data, you're giving that over because it was initially justified on the basis of counterterrorism. We see it in the adoption of spyware, the use of spyware. And again, for all of these contexts, what is used as the rationale is the justification of exceptional security threat, and the promise that these things will only be used in a limited way. And in reality, that's simply not the case. We're seeing wide-scale, massive abuse of these technologies as they are mainstreamed into general use. But even when they're being technically used for these counterterrorism or security purposes, we're seeing a persistent pattern of abuse of those technologies against vulnerable populations, against civil society actors, against journalists, against trade unionists, against ordinary people who protest or people who simply disagree with their governments. And so high-tech risk and essentially high-risk technologies are being brought in through the proverbial back door of counterterrorism. And they're being validated by appeals to security, and then they are being mainstreamed. So let me give you two quick examples before we go to Q&A. One is the deepening interface and use of unmanned aerial systems, drones, and the ways in which the use of drones has moved from something quite exceptional, still problematic, but exceptional, into ordinary use in multiple societies. What we're seeing is that drone technology is proliferating at remarkable speed. In many countries, you can pick one up at a store and build it in your backyard. The result of that, in the context where there is no global regulation of drone technology, is a massive gap in human rights protection when such technologies are deployed. And we need to remember that when drone technology was first used, it was used and deployed in the context of armed conflicts by states saying that they needed to use these technologies in places to address conflict-related situations. Much of that use was happening in geographies where counter-terrorism was the rationale for deploying drones. And that was highly controversial. It remains highly controversial. It's sometimes something that my mandate has condemned and remains deeply concerned about. But what we're seeing now is something quite different, which is this pathway that I've described in the report, which is that something that starts off as exceptional, drones being used on battlefields, quote, far away, to drones being used for regular policing enforcement in multiple jurisdictions. And I've listed them in my report for those who want to take a look. And so drones have now become part of the arsenal of regular policing in multiple states, minus human rights protection or any international prohibition or regulation. And again, what we see in the national context of drone use is justifications of counter-terrorism validating the use of drones for domestic purposes. And a couple of things to say about drones. If you have a drone hovering in a particular area, it's not just picking up information on one particular person or one particular problem. It soaks up vast amounts of surveillance information on many people. And one of the biggest challenges we see in the increased use of drones for surveillance is that it is ordinary people whose data is being collected, ordinary people who have no right to the information that's being collected on them, and no or little regulation of the use of that data by the state. The second huge consequence about domestic drone deployment by police is the quick move that we saw when we saw drones deployed in battlefield contexts, where originally they were used for surveillance, to the use of force by drones. And so we can expect, and we have already seen, the arming of drones for protest purposes. We've seen the development of drones by manufacturers, and I list all of them in my report, private companies who are exploiting this space of non-regulation to provide lethal weapons that will be used in ordinary domestic contexts that are under-regulated as a matter of international law. And so my report is very clear. I concur with the High Commissioner's view that we need a moratorium on the specific use of this technology of weaponized unmanned aerial drones. And we need greater and systemic regulation of their use for surveillance purposes, including the right to know and regulate the data that is collected by these kinds of technologies for ordinary people. The second technology I just want to briefly address, and the report looks at in depth, is the use of biometric data technology. And as the Council and many people may know, we actually have a global mandate from the UN Security Council passed in 2017 in a resolution 2396 that authorizes every country on the planet to collect biometric data on every single person on the planet. And the basis of that Security Council resolution was the particular regional problem of the travel of what are called foreign terrorist fighters. So to go back to the analogy I started with, you start off with a use that's exceptional for a perceived sort of small problem or specific problem, and what you end up with is a mandate to collect the most intimate private data that we have, which is our biometric data information, and to use that to collect data on essentially every human being on the planet. And it's, to be clear, the Security Council did not add a whole host of human rights protections when they created the mandate to collect data. This collection of biometric data has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen states, for often reasons of necessity or concern, rely on biometric data more consistently than they've had in the past. But the result, again, is that we live in an international context where there is no regulation of this biometric data collection. We have few states with adequate data protection or privacy laws, and the potential for misuse of these technologies is enormously high. So the report I issued makes a couple of very specific recommendations to states. The first is that if you're going to collect data, counter-terrorism data, at national level, you have to have in correspondence national legislation that protects data of the persons whose data is being collected, used, transferred, and stored. All of us have a right to that as a fundamental human right. It seems to me that in a digital age, if we don't have those rights, we actually lose an enormous space of protection. We give away that space of protection to security dictates that have little concerns for the rights of individuals. The second thing we need is independent data collection agencies to be overseen by some form of independent oversight mechanism. And that's particularly true of the intelligence services in many countries, who are at the forefront of collecting data and transferring data. And that kind of independent oversight needs to be budgeted for, and it needs to be technologically sufficient, meaning you can't have the intelligence agencies having all of these methods of collection and having oversight mechanism not having the similar kinds of technological capacity to oversee the collection. These two things have to match. The third thing, I've said it already, is we need a moratorium on the sale, transfer, and use of lethal autonomous weapons while we work towards a global ban. So while we get to a ban, we need a moratorium. Fifthly, we need to make sure that the regulation of artificial intelligence cannot be subject to national security exemptions. So many states are regulating AI, but many states are also saying that when you have AI, you can exempt any protections you have if it's AI collection in the context of national security. We need export regimes for cross-border trade in surveillance technologies. Surveillance technologies are being traded across the globe, and the people who are most affected by them are the most vulnerable. They are the people who often disagree with their governments, or criticize their governments, or monitor their governments, or would like to argue for certain things that their governments don't want. And we have an arena which is entirely unregulated. And so, again, we have to have robust global commitments by states to oversee these kinds of technology transfers. And finally, in the context of biometric, the report makes the case for, again, a moratorium on the use of remote biometric recognition technologies in public spaces. So if we're wandering around public spaces with drones or other kinds of data collection traveling overhead, we need to make sure that the authorities who are using that technology can demonstrate that they are in compliance with privacy and data protection services standards in order to ensure that our most intimate data is protected. So those are the recommendations of the report. I look forward to your questions and happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you, and we will now move to questions. Please state your name and organization before you ask your question. Jeremy, Jeremy from Radio France.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? I think you can hear me, yeah? Okay, that's correct. I apologize, but my question is not necessarily about the report, but merely about the recent visit that you made in Guantanamo. I think that you were expecting this. So what can you tell us about the recent visit that you made?
Thank you for the question. And as those who are on the call may know, the mandate I hold after a year of intensive discussions and negotiations with the United States government following the report I issued last spring on the ongoing detention facilities at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, I was invited to undertake a technical visit to the facility. This is the first UN visit to the facility consistent with the terms of reference for UN procedure mandate holder visits, meeting all the requirements that we require in order for such a visit to be discharged consistent with the terms of reference for special procedure mandate holders. The visit comprises of 3 parts. The first is the visit to the facility, which I undertook at the beginning of February. The second is the discharge of my commitment to the victims of terrorism and an extensive series of engagements with the victims of the 9/11 terrorist attack. And the third is engagement with those who've been repatriated or returned from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba to their countries of origin or their third countries. And that visit is ongoing. So I've completed the first part of the visit, which is the visit to the site. But the other 2 parts will be completed over the next month and a half. So pending the full completion of the visit, I'm not going to preempt my findings. I made a statement yesterday which acknowledged the historic importance of this visit, the significance of opening up the detention facility to UN special procedure mechanisms. But I won't be issuing any comment on the visit until I complete my report. And there will be a full press conference and the issuance of a full report on all 3 aspects of the visit at the end of the technical visit.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for the Special Rapporteur? Any other questions?
Maybe just to say that I understand that there is a great deal of interest in the technical visit, rightly so. I also understand that it will be a matter of public interest. There will be a full report. There will be the normal procedure in relation to end of mission statements, and a press conference will take place in the middle of June. And we do hope that you will remain interested and come back. We think this is an important visit for the whole variety of reasons that have sparked interest in asking the question, but I cannot comment on it until the visit is complete.
Thank you. And if there are no, there's a question from Isabel.
Yes, good afternoon. I am Isabel Saco. I work for the Spanish news agency. I just want to know if you, on all the variety of comments that you have made on the surveillance issue, if you have identified countries that are of more concern than others. We know all. We have extensively spoken about the situation in China, how the surveillance strengthens there more and more. We can have maybe the example of Russia, if you can comment on that. And also the trend in Europe, for example. How do you see if you or if you see that Europe is following the trend of other part of the world where the surveillance of the citizens without regulatory mechanisms or mechanisms that protects their human rights have been established. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Really important question. So the report does in fact identify 3 countries that we have identified particular concern with. And those follow from long-standing other communications by the mandate I hold to the countries in question. I have articulated my profound concern in the report concerning the wide-scale surveillance in the Xinjiang Autonomous Province by the government of China and the concerns about the use of that data in that context. I have in the report identified my significant concern with the use of surveillance technologies by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories and the significant implications of the collection of mass data in a situation of belligerent occupation where the 4th Geneva Convention requires that any action taken is in the best interest of the civilian population. The scale of the data collection seems incompatible with the obligations of the belligerent occupier in that context. And the 3rd country setting that's identified in the report is Somalia. And again, concerns have been raised. I've raised concerns in the report about the widespread use of biometric data, particularly on communities who are already marginalized and viewed as outsider or marginal in the Somali context, and the lack in particular of formal legal protections under data protection law or privacy law in Somalia, which is commensurate with the scale of the data that has been collected. Outside of those 3 countries, I'll speak to some general trends that the mandate has communicated on. We have raised a number of issues in the report relating and in other communications about surveillance. One country that we've recently communicated on is Ireland in respect of the Garda Bill, which is a piece of legislation designed to put Ireland at the forefront of collecting personal, intimate data around on all its citizens. It's in its 2nd reading in the Irish Parliament, and the mandate has communicated to the government its deep concern that the use of that kind of technology is absent both the adequate protections in the national context, but also that the necessity, the deployment of this kind of technology needs to pass a couple of tests. One is necessity, the other is proportionality and non-discrimination. And there are deep concerns on all 3 aspects in respect of that legislation. I've also identified the pending AI regulation in the context of the European Union, which is not yet public. So the mandate report makes a call for the EU to be more transparent about its process of data regulation in the AI context. I am very concerned, and the report says this, that the trend in Europe is towards these exemptions, national security exemptions, and the EU directive on this matter, the mandate strongly makes the case that it should not have a national security exemption to set a good practice model for European states. The other area context in Europe that I've commented on in the report is the Council of Europe's pending regulation in this area. Again, deep concern that there isn't sufficient transparency and engagement with various stakeholders, particularly civil society. And maybe just to your comment about, what do we have to say to European states? We've seen an extraordinary increase in surveillance technologies being deployed as a matter of kind of ordinary course in the European context. And the message that's sent from that scale of surveillance in a democratic society, which is not matched by a similar commitment to privacy rights and to data collection protection, is that we actually fundamentally are carving out a whole spectrum of state action from the regular assumptions of human rights norms. And so Europe has an important role to play in demonstrating that it is possible to function without living in a surveillance society. And it does not serve our democracies well to engage in the kinds of widespread practices of data collection, data storage, data use, and surveillance that we're seeing across the European continent.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for the Special Rapporteur? No other questions? If there are no other questions, we will close this press conference. Thank you for joining us, and thank you very much to the Special Rapporteur.
Thank you all. Thank you.